the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon and no one noticed. Let me take you back to July 29, 2024. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, was conducting routine operations in the Caribbean routine, that is, until a Venezuelan Su-30 flanker fighter intercepted a U.S. Navy EP-3E reconnaissance aircraft in international airspace. The Venezuelan jet didn't just shadow the American plane, it performed an aggressive maneuver, coming within 100 feet of the EP-3E, forcing it into evasive action. The Pentagon called it unsafe and unprofessional. The Venezuelan government called it a sovereign act of defense. The media reported it as another minor incident in a long line of US-Venezuela tensions. But here's what they're not telling: this wasn't just another close call. This was a calculated provocation, one that could have triggered a kinetic response. And if you think that's an exaggeration, you haven't been paying attention to how close we've come to war in the past 5 years. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, and I can tell you with absolute this incident was not an accident. It was a test. And the United States, whether it realizes it or not, is being drawn into a trap, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere for the next century. Now, let's start with the official story, because that's where the deception begins. The official what they want you to believe. On the surface, this looks like a standard case of Venezuelan brinkmanship. The U.S. has been conducting surveillance flights near Venezuela for years, monitoring everything from drug trafficking to Russian and Iranian military activity. The Venezuelan government, led by Nicolas Maduro, has long accused the U.S. of violating its sovereignty, and this interception was framed as a defensive measure. The Pentagon's statement was the U.S. Navy aircraft was operating in international airspace when it was intercepted by a Venezuelan Su-30. The maneuver was unsafe and inconsistent with international norms. The State Department echoed this, calling on Venezuela to cease these provocative actions. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan Ministry of Defense doubled down, claiming the U.S. plane had intruded into Venezuelan airspace and that the interception was necessary to protect national security. The media, as usual, played along. CNN ran a segment with a retired admiral calling it a dangerous escalation. Fox News framed it as another sign of Maduro's recklessness. The New York Times buried the story on page A12, treating it as just another footnote in the long saga of US-Venezuela tensions. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the US EP-3E was not in Venezuelan airspace. The flight path was over international waters, while outside the 12 nautical mile limit. The Venezuelan claim of an intrusion is legally baseless. Second, the Su-30's maneuver wasn't just unsafe, it was deliberately aggressive. Coming within 100 feet of a reconnaissance aircraft isn't standard procedure, it's a message. And third, this wasn't the first time Venezuela had done this. In fact, it was the third such interception in the past 6 months. So why now? Why escalate at this exact moment? Here's where the official story starts to unravel. The hidden facts behind the incident. Let's start with the timing. This interception didn't happen in a vacuum. It came just days after the U.S. announced new sanctions on Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA, in response to Maduro's crackdown on opposition figures. It also followed a high-level meeting in Moscow between Venezuelan and Russian defense officials, where they discussed deepening military cooperation. Now, let's talk about the Su-30. Venezuela's air force is a shadow of what it once was. After years of economic collapse, most of its aircraft are grounded due to lack of maintenance. But the Su-30s? Those are operational. And they're not just any jets, they're Russian-made, equipped with advanced radar and anti-ship missiles. The fact that Venezuela could scramble one at all, let alone execute a high-risk interception, suggests outside support. And that's where things get interesting. In the weeks leading up to the incident, satellite imagery showed increased activity at Venezuela's Palo Negro Air Base, where the Su-30s are stationed. More importantly, intelligence sources reported the arrival of Russian technical advisors, something the Kremlin has denied, but which U.S. Southern Command has confirmed. This wasn't just a Venezuelan operation. It was a Russian-backed operation. But why would Russia care about a U.S. reconnaissance flight in the Caribbean? The answer lies in what the EP-3E was actually doing. The EP-3E is a signals intelligence aircraft. Its job is to collect electronic emissions, radar signatures, communications, missile telemetry. And in this case, it wasn't just monitoring Venezuela. It was monitoring Russian activity. Specifically, it was tracking the movements of the Admiral Gorshkov, a Russian frigate that had recently docked in La Guaira, Venezuela's main port. The Gorshkov isn't just any ship. It's one of Russia's most advanced warships, capable of launching hypersonic missiles. And its presence in the Caribbean wasn't a routine port call. It was a demonstration, a show of force meant to signal that Russia can project power into America's backyard. So when the Venezuelan Su-30 intercepted the EP-3E, it wasn't just defending Venezuelan airspace. It was protecting Russian assets. And that changes everything. Now, I'm not saying this was a direct order from the Kremlin. But I am saying that Moscow knew about it, approved of it, and likely provided the technical support to make it happen. This was a proxy provocation, a way for Russia to test US resolve without risking direct confrontation. And the US response? Silence. No retaliation. No escalation. Just a strongly worded statement. That, my friends, is the real story here. Venezuela didn't just make a fatal error. It made a calculated one. And the US fell right into the trap. The extra geopolitical why this matters more than you think. To understand why this incident is so significant, you have to out. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle for global dominance between the US, Russia, and China. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that it is the sole superpower, with no real challengers. But that era is over. We are now in a multipolar world, where Russia and China are actively working to erode American influence. And one of the key battlegrounds? The Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, which declared the Americas off limits to foreign powers, has been dead for decades. But the US still acts as if it's alive. Meanwhile, Russia and China have been making inroads. China has become South America's largest trading partner. Russia has deepened military ties with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And both countries have used economic leverage, loans, infrastructure projects, arms sales, to pull Latin American nations into their orbit. This isn't just about ideology. It's about resources. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world. The Amazon rainforest is a critical carbon sink. And the Caribbean is a choke point for global trade. Whoever controls these assets controls the 21st century. Now, let's talk about the real reason Russia is in Venezuela. It's not just about oil. It's about leverage. Russia knows that the US is stretched thin militarily, economically, politically. It knows that America's attention is divided between Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, and now, increasingly, its own domestic chaos. And it knows that the US has no appetite for another war. So what does Russia do? It pokes. It prods. It tests. And when the US doesn't respond, it pushes a little harder. This is classic great power competition. It's how the Cold War was fought, not with direct conflict, but with proxy wars, covert operations, and calculated provocations. And right now, Russia is winning. The US has two options here. It can either retreat, ceding influence in its own hemisphere, or it can escalate, risking a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power. Neither option is good. But the status quo, the US pretending it can still enforce the Monroe Doctrine while doing nothing to counter Russian and Chinese encroachment, that's the worst option of all. Because here's the hard: if the US doesn't draw a line now, it will have to draw one later. And by then, it may be too late. Military and strategic, the domino effect of weakness. Let's talk about the military reality here. The USS Gerald R. Ford was in the Caribbean for a reason. It wasn't just on a training exercise. It was there to deter. To send a message to Venezuela, Russia, and China that the US still has the capability and the will to project power in its own backyard. But deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And right now, they don't. The Venezuelan interception was a test. And the US failed it. By not responding, the US sent a "you can get away with this." And that signal won't just embolden Venezuela. It will embolden every adversary watching. Let's look at the numbers. The US has 11 aircraft carriers. Russia has 1. China has 3. But here's the carriers are vulnerable. In a real conflict, they're floating targets. The Ford is the most advanced carrier in the world, but it's also the most expensive and the most tempting prize for an adversary. Now, imagine this: Venezuela, with Russian backing, conducts another interception. This time, the US responds with a show of force, a flyover, a naval exercise. Venezuela escalates. Maybe they fire a warning shot. Maybe they don't. But at some point, the US has to: do we back down, or do we strike? If the US backs down, it loses credibility. If it strikes, it risks a wider war. And that's the trap. This is how wars start, not with a bang, but with a series of small, seemingly insignificant escalations. Each side thinks it can control the outcome. Each side thinks the other will back down. And then, suddenly, you're in a shooting war. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of World War III. But I am saying that the US is playing a dangerous game by allowing these provocations to go unanswered. Because every time the US blinks, its adversaries take another step forward. And here's the US knows this. The Pentagon has wargamed these scenarios. They know that if Russia and China see weakness, they will exploit it. But the political leadership, the White House, Congress, doesn't have the stomach for confrontation. That's the real problem. Not the military. Not the strategy. The political will. The domestic political why. This is about more than just Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. The Biden administration's response to the Venezuelan interception was weak. And that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of a growing number of national security experts, including some within the administration itself. So why the weak response? To domestic politics. The Biden administration is in a precarious position. Inflation is still high. The border crisis is out of control. And the 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on Biden's leadership. The last thing the White House wants is another foreign policy crisis, especially one that could escalate into a war. But here's the weakness invites aggression. And right now, the US is projecting weakness on multiple fronts. Let's look at the key. 1. The White House, Biden's foreign policy team is divided. On one side, you have the realists, people like Jake Sullivan, who understand the dangers of great power competition. On the other side, you have the idealists, people like Samantha Power, who still believe in the myth of American moral leadership. The realists want to contain Russia and China. The idealists want to transform them. And in the middle? A president who doesn't want to rock the boat. 2. Congress, the Republican-controlled House, is pushing for a harder line on Venezuela. But they're also the same people who blocked aid to Ukraine, who want to cut defense spending, and who are more interested in scoring political points than in actual strategy. Meanwhile, the Democrats are terrified of being seen as warmongers, so they're content to let the status quo continue. 3. The military, the Pentagon is furious. They've been warning for years about the erosion of US deterrence. But they also know that if they push too hard, they'll be accused of escalating tensions. So they're stuck in this limbo, unable to act, but unable to ignore the threat. And then there's the public. Most Americans don't care about Venezuela. They don't understand the strategic implications. They just want the government to focus on kitchen table issues. And the media? They're not helping. Instead of explaining why this incident matters, they're treating it as just another foreign policy footnote. This is the problem with democracy. In the short term, it's easier to ignore threats than to confront them. But in the long term, that's how empires fall. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the US backs down. In this scenario, the US continues its current policy of strategic patience. It issues more sanctions. It conducts more surveillance flights. But it doesn't retaliate. Venezuela, emboldened, conducts more interceptions. Russia and China increase their presence in the region. Over time, the US loses influence in its own hemisphere. By 2030, Venezuela is a de facto Russian client state, and the US is forced to accept a new multipolar reality in the Americas. This is the most likely scenario. It's also the most dangerous, because its sets of the US can be pushed around in its own backyard. Scenario 2, the US draws a line. In this scenario, the US decides it's had enough. It responds to the next Venezuelan provocation with a show of force, maybe a naval blockade, maybe a cyber attack on Venezuelan military systems. Venezuela, caught off guard, backs down. Russia and China protest, but they don't escalate. The US reasserts its dominance in the region, and the status quo is restored. This is the best-case scenario. But it's also the least likely, because it requires political will, and right now, the US doesn't have it. Scenario 3, escalation to conflict. In this scenario, the US responds to a Venezuelan provocation with a kinetic strike, maybe a cruise missile attack on a military base, maybe a drone strike on a high-value target. Venezuela retaliates. Russia provides military support. The US is drawn into a proxy war, and before long, we're in a direct conflict with Russia. This is the worst-case scenario. It's also the least likely, but not impossible. And if it happens, it won't be because of one incident. It will be because of a series of miscalculations, each one more dangerous than the last. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. But the first one, the one where the US does nothing, is the most dangerous, because it ensures that the problem will only get worse. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. This strategy has led to some successes and some spectacular failures. But here's the liberal hegemony is unsustainable. It requires endless military interventions, endless spending, and endless political capital. And right now, the US doesn't have any of those things left. The American people are exhausted. They don't want another war. They don't want to be the world's policeman. And they're right. The US can't afford to be the global hegemon anymore. But here's the: if the US retreats, it doesn't mean the world becomes more peaceful. It means other powers fill the vacuum. And those powers, Russia, China, Iran, don't share America's values. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in human rights. They believe in power. This is the central dilemma of American foreign policy today. Do we continue to pursue liberal hegemony, even though it's bankrupting us? Or do we accept a multipolar world, even though it means ceding influence to our adversaries? There's no easy answer. But one thing is, the status quo is not an option. Alternatives: and what should the US do? So what should the US do about Venezuela? Let me offer a few recommendations, controversial, but necessary. 1. Stop pretending the Monroe Doctrine still exists. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US can't enforce it, and pretending it can only leads to humiliation. Instead of trying to dominate the Western Hemisphere, the US should compete in it through trade, diplomacy, and soft power. 2. Use targeted economic pressure, not broad sanctions. The current US sanctions regime against Venezuela is a blunt instrument that hurts ordinary people far more than the regime. Instead of starving the country into submission, Washington should go after specific individuals: Maduro, his inner circle, the generals who profit from corruption, and freeze their assets, deny them visas, and cut off their access to the global financial system. The Magnitsky Act is a perfect tool for this. It's surgical, it's legal, and it doesn't require a single soldier to set foot in Caracas. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US has already tried this approach, with mixed results. In 2019, the Trump administration sanctioned PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company, effectively cutting off the regime's main source of revenue. The idea was strangle the regime's finances, force Maduro to negotiate. But here's the problem: China and Russia stepped in. Beijing became Venezuela's largest creditor, and Moscow sent in Wagner Group mercenaries to prop up the regime. The sanctions didn't collapse Maduro, they just made him more dependent on America's adversaries. This is the uncomfortable truth about economic warfare in the 21st. It only works if you can isolate your target completely. And in a multipolar world, complete isolation is nearly impossible. So if the US wants to use economic pressure, it needs to coordinate with allies, especially in Europe, to close off every possible loophole. That means cracking down on shell companies, enforcing secondary sanctions, and making it clear to banks in London, Zurich, and Dubai that doing business with Maduro's cronies will cost them access to the US financial system. But even that might not be enough. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The real lesson here is that the US can no longer unilaterally dictate outcomes in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, as I mentioned earlier, is dead, and not just because the US lacks the will to enforce it. It's dead because the world has changed. China is now the largest trading partner for most of Latin America. Russia is selling arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Iran is sending drones and advisors. The Western Hemisphere is no longer an American lake, it's a contested space. So what does that mean for US military posture? Here's where things get tricky. The USS Gerald R. Ford incident wasn't just a provocation, it was a test. Maduro wanted to see how far he could push before the US pushed back. And the fact that he got away with it sends a dangerous signal to every other adversary. The US is hesitant to use force, even when its red lines are crossed. Now, I'm not advocating for a military strike on Venezuela. That would be a disaster, politically, economically, and strategically. But the US does need to rethink its deterrence strategy in the region. Right now, the message is muddled. The US has a carrier strike group in the Caribbean, but it's not clear what it's there to do. Is it to deter aggression? To project power? To reassure allies? The answer seems to be all of the above, and none of them effectively. Let's look at the numbers. The US has 11 aircraft carriers, but only a handful are deployed at any given time. The Ford is the most advanced carrier in the world, but it's also a $13 billion sitting duck if it's not properly defended. And here's the thing: Venezuela's Navy is a joke. Its Air Force is a museum. Its military is corrupt and demoralized. So why did the US allow this provocation to go unanswered? The answer, I think, lies in the broader crisis of American deterrence. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgencies in the Middle East, where the rules of engagement were vague and the objectives were unclear. Now, it's facing a world where great power competition is back and the old playbook doesn't work. You can't deter China with a carrier strike group if China has hypersonic missiles that can sink it. You can't deter Russia with economic sanctions if Russia is willing to absorb the pain. And you can't deter Venezuela with sternly worded statements if Venezuela knows the US won't follow through. This is the central challenge for US grand strategy in the 2020s. How do you deter adversaries in a world where traditional military power is less effective, but where economic and diplomatic tools are also increasingly constrained? The answer, I believe, lies in asymmetric deterrence, using unconventional tools to raise the cost of aggression without triggering a direct confrontation. For example, the US could respond to Venezuela's provocation by increasing support for opposition groups inside the country, not with weapons, but with intelligence, cyber tools, and financial support. It could work with Colombia and Brazil to create a regional security framework that isolates Venezuela diplomatically. It could use its control over the global financial system to make it harder for Maduro to sell oil, even to China and Russia. None of these steps would require a single bomb to be dropped, but they would make life much harder for the regime. Here's the thing: none of this will work if the US doesn't have a coherent strategy. Right now, American foreign policy is reactive. The White House responds to crises as they emerge, but it doesn't have a long-term plan for dealing with revisionist powers like Venezuela, or for managing the decline of US hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And that's a problem, because in geopolitics, the side with the clearer vision usually wins. Let me give you an example. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration had a clear strategy for dealing with the Soviet contain it, outspend it, and wait for it to collapse. That strategy worked, but it required patience, consistency, and a willingness to take risks. Today, the US doesn't have that kind of strategic clarity. Instead, it lurches from crisis to crisis, with each administration reversing the policies of the last. Obama normalized relations with Cuba, Trump reversed course, Biden tried to re-engage, and now we're back to square one. That kind of inconsistency makes it impossible to deter adversaries, because they never know what the US will do. So where does that leave us? The US needs a new grand strategy for Latin America, one that recognizes the limits of American power but doesn't abandon the region to its adversaries. That means competing with China and Russia for influence, but not through military force. It means supporting democracy, but not through regime change. It means using economic tools, but in a way that doesn't punish ordinary people. And most importantly, it means accepting that the US can no longer dictate outcomes in its own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The question now is what replaces it. And that, my friends, is the real geopolitical challenge of our time. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's recent provocation near the USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't just a reckless gamble by Maduro, it was a calculated move designed to serve multiple domestic political purposes. And that's where the real story gets interesting, because the regime's survival strategy isn't just about defying Washington, it's about manipulating the very fabric of Venezuelan society to maintain power at all costs. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2013, when Maduro inherited Chávez's revolution, the regime has faced an existential how to govern a country where the economy has collapsed, where over 7 million people have fled, and where the opposition, despite being fractured, still commands significant support. The answer? Manufactured crises. The Maduro government doesn't just tolerate instability, it actively cultivates it, because in a state of perpetual emergency, the population is too exhausted to organize, too divided to resist, and too dependent on the regime's meager handouts to risk rebellion. Take the 2018 presidential election, for example. The opposition boycotted it after the regime banned its most popular candidates, including Leopoldo López and Enrique Capriles. The result? Maduro won with 68% of the vote, but turnout was a dismal 46%, the lowest in Venezuela's democratic history. The international community, including the US and the EU, refused to recognize the result. But here's the Maduro didn't care. The election wasn't about legitimacy, it was about consolidating power. By eliminating credible opposition, he ensured that any future challenge would come from within his own coalition, a far easier threat to manage. Now, fast forward to 2024. The regime is weaker than ever. Inflation, though slightly tamed by dollarization, still hovers around 200% annually. Oil production, the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted to just 750,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The sanctions relief that Biden briefly offered in 2023, in exchange for electoral concessions, has largely evaporated after Maduro reneged on his promises. And yet, the regime persists. How? By weaponizing nationalism. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's decision to send a patrol boat near the USS Gerald R. Ford wasn't just a show of defiance, it was a deliberate provocation designed to rally his base. The Venezuelan military, despite its corruption and inefficiency, remains the most powerful institution in the country. And for years, Maduro has bought its loyalty through a combination of patronage, ideological indoctrination, and sheer fear. But even the military is fracturing. In 2019, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez reportedly considered defecting during Juan Guaido's attempted uprising. In 2020, a group of dissident officers launched a failed drone attack on Maduro. And in 2023, the regime purged dozens of mid-ranking officers on suspicion of disloyalty. So what does Maduro do when his own generals start questioning his leadership? He manufactures an external enemy. The US has been the perfect bogeyman for decades, but in recent years, Maduro has added a new Guyana. By reviving Venezuela's century-old claim to the Essequibo region, a territory that makes up two-thirds of Guyana and is rich in oil and minerals, Maduro has given the military a new mission. And it's working. In December 2023, the regime held a referendum on annexing Essequibo, which it claimed was approved by 95% of voters. Independent observers called it a sham, but the propaganda value was immense. Suddenly, the military had a cause to rally around, and Maduro had a way to distract from the country's economic misery. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions of this latest stunt near the USS Gerald R. Ford. The timing is no coincidence. Maduro is facing a presidential election in July 2024, and for the first time in years, the opposition has a real chance to unify behind a single candidate. Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista, won the opposition primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote. The regime, in a rare moment of weakness, allowed the primary to proceed only to immediately ban Machado from running. But the damage was done. Machado's popularity has soared, and even the Biden administration, which had been trying to negotiate with Maduro, has been forced to take a harder line. So what does Maduro do? He escalates. By provoking the U.S. Navy, he accomplishes three things. First, he reinforces the narrative that Venezuela is under siege, which justifies his authoritarian rule. Second, he tests the Biden administration's resolve. If the U.S. doesn't respond forcefully, Maduro can claim victory and use it to bolster his image as a strongman. If the U.S. does respond, he can frame it as imperialist aggression and rally his base. And third, he creates a distraction. While the world focuses on the naval standoff, the regime can crack down on the opposition, arrest activists, and manipulate the election without drawing too much attention. But here's the problem with Maduro's: it's unsustainable. The Venezuelan military may be loyal for now, but loyalty in authoritarian regimes is always transactional. As the economy continues to deteriorate, even the generals will start to question whether Maduro is worth defending. And that's when things get dangerous. We've seen this movie before, in Libya, in Syria, in Zimbabwe. When dictators lose the support of their security forces, they don't go quietly. They lash out, they escalate, and they take their countries down with them. So what's the most likely scenario for Venezuela in the next 12 to 18 months? Let me lay out three possibilities. The first is what I call the managed decline scenario. In this version, Maduro allows a controlled opening. Maybe he lets Machado run in the election, but under such restrictive conditions that she can't win. He might lift some sanctions, attract a bit of foreign investment, and even allow a limited return of exiles. But the regime remains in power, and the country remains a dysfunctional petrostate. This is the scenario the Biden administration is quietly hoping for, because it avoids a collapse without requiring a real transition to democracy. The problem? It's a fantasy. Maduro has no incentive to reform, and the opposition has no reason to accept a rigged election. The second scenario is the Syrian model. In this version, Maduro doubles down on repression. He bans Machado outright, arrests her supporters, and turns the election into a farce. The US and EU impose new sanctions, but China and Russia step in to prop up the regime. Venezuela becomes a pariah state, but it survives, at least for a while. The risk here is that the country descends into a low-intensity civil war, with armed groups, drug cartels, and rogue military units fighting for control. We're already seeing signs of this in the border regions with Colombia, where dissident FARC factions and Venezuelan colectivos are battling for territory. The third scenario is the black swan. This is the least likely but most dangerous outcome. In this version, something unexpected happens: a military coup, a popular uprising, or a catastrophic economic collapse that forces Maduro from power. The problem is that Venezuela doesn't have a clear successor. Chavez built a cult of personality, and Maduro has spent the last decade purging anyone who could challenge him. If he falls, the country could descend into chaos, with rival factions fighting for control. And that's when the US, China, and Russia would start jockeying for influence, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground. Now, I know which scenario is most likely. My money is on a hybrid of the first two, a slow-motion collapse with periodic escalations. Maduro will keep provoking the US and Guyana, not because he wants war, but because he needs the threat of war to justify his rule. The opposition will keep pushing for change, but it's too divided and too weak to force a transition. And the international community will keep dithering, because no one wants to deal with the mess that is Venezuela. But this isn't just a Venezuelan problem. It's a regional problem, and it's a global problem. Venezuela is a failed state in America's backyard, and its collapse is destabilizing the entire hemisphere. Colombia is struggling to absorb millions of refugees. Brazil is dealing with cross-border crime and smuggling. And the US is facing a migration crisis that's becoming a political liability for Biden. So what should the US do? First, it needs to stop pretending that Maduro is a legitimate leader. The Biden administration's policy of engagement has failed. It's time to return to a policy of maximum pressure, but with a twist. Instead of just sanctioning the regime, the US should target its enablers. That means going after the military officers who profit from corruption, the businessmen who launder money, and the foreign banks that facilitate their schemes. It also means working with allies to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. If the US can get the EU, Canada, and key Latin American countries to recognize Machado as the legitimate leader, it would put enormous pressure on Maduro. Second, the US needs to prepare for the day after Maduro. That means working with the opposition to develop a transition plan, but also engaging with the military to ensure that any change in power doesn't lead to chaos. This is delicate work, but it's not impossible. The US has done it before, in Chile in 1989, in South Africa in 1994, and in Indonesia in 1998. The key is to offer the military a way amnesty for some, exile for others, and a role in a post-Maduro government for those who defect. And third, the US needs to counter China and Russia's influence in Venezuela. That doesn't mean military intervention, it means offering the Venezuelan people a better alternative. Right now, China is Venezuela's biggest creditor, and Russia is its biggest arms supplier. But neither country is invested in Venezuela's long-term stability. The US should be offering investment, trade, and development assistance, but only if Venezuela moves toward democracy. It's a carrot-and-stick approach, and it's the only way to break the cycle of dependency that keeps Maduro in power. Let me be, none of this will be easy. Venezuela is a mess, and there are no good options. But the status quo is unsustainable. The longer Maduro stays in power, the worse the crisis will get. And the longer the US dithers, the more influence China and Russia will gain. So here's my: by the end of 2025, Venezuela will either be on the path to recovery or it will be a failed state on the brink of collapse. The difference will come down to whether the US and its allies have the strategic clarity to act before it's too late. And right now, I'm not optimistic.